So Jeanette is from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Lancashire, and I don't mention it, but it's just amazing that Neil sent me that film about what was going on in Canada. And some of you may have looked at it, and they talked about carbon-13, and then all these American accents, and all of a sudden there was somebody sounding like they came from Lancashire. Well, they did, which is wonderful. So they got it.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm really interested to share what knowledge I have with you and to learn more about the issues that you're facing in your farms and trying to work together to improve management and work towards kind of sustainability goals, which I think are really important. This is my first introduction to your group, and so I don't really have a good feeling for the kind of level of knowledge, so I hope I'm not teaching grandmas to suck eggs in some of the stuff I'm telling you, but I think it's really important that you really understand how carbon is cycled through your soils and through your plant systems, so that you understand and remember that when you're thinking about how your management is going to affect those processes. I'm just going to spend a few minutes at the start telling you a little bit about my organisation, CEH, and some of the projects that we've been involved in over the last few years which have relevance to the stuff you're talking about today. Then I'm going to talk about measuring soil carbon, soil organic matter, which John's asked me to talk about, kind of more formal measures and the kinds of measures we use. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the apps, mobile apps that we've developed with CEH and the British Geological Survey, which you can access if you have an iPhone or an iPad to improve your understanding and awareness of soils. So CEH is a government research institute. I'm based in Lancaster. I've been there for 20 years. And we also have sites in Scotland and North Wales and Wallingford, not very far away from here. And we're a UK Centre of Excellence for studies in the freshwater and terrestrial environments. Soils research goes across the 4 sites. We have expertise to all the locations, but the work that we do at Lancaster is focused on the effects of land use and land management, and also climate change impacts on soil processes, particularly soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and changes in carbon storage and changes in nitrous oxide, methane and CO2, and how they're impacted by how we manage the land and how they're going to be impacted going forward into the future into climate change. We work in grasslands, forestry, peatlands, perennial bioenergy crops, we work in Southeast Asia on oil palm, tropical forests, massive diversity, because essentially the processes that happen between plants, soil and microbes are the same wherever you are in the world and whatever system you're working in. And so we use the expertise to try and inform studies in these areas. So this is one project where we've looked at the effects of land management on soil carbon. There's a £4 million study funded by the Energy Technologies Institute because government felt there was a gap in knowledge around the effects of planting bioenergy crops. So in the UK we plant perennial bioenergy crops, miscanthus, which is a perennial grass that grows up to 3 or 4 metres tall, and also short rotation poppies of willow and poplar. And we didn't really understand or be able to measure the effects on soil carbon. And for bioenergy crops, that's really important because the whole point of them is to save greenhouse gases, to produce a crop which can be used for energy that can mitigate climate change. And so there was kind of perceived wisdom that because these are perennial crops, you're not regularly ploughing the soil, that there would be soil carbon sequestration. And they're typically low input crops, so you might expect that there'd be less nitrous oxide, but there wasn't really the numbers there in the evidence base. And so we did a huge project across a whole range of sites in the UK, and all of the data from that fed into a model. And we looked at what happened when you planted these crops onto an arable versus a grassland to see if there were any real differences in the outcomes. And a really simple message from that project was that actually there's a massive difference in what happens when you plant onto an arable or grassland. If you plant these perennial crops onto arable land, because they typically start with a low carbon starting stock, you get this increase in soil carbon. So soil carbon over 20 years under miscanthus, a perennial grass on arable land. And these are predictions from the model, but they're based around a lot of measurements and a lot of, I think, 3 big bends worth of soil cores that we collected through the whole project. And so you get a very similar pattern with willow. You get a little loss to start with, and that's mainly because willow takes longer to establish, but then you get this increase. But on grasslands, it's the reverse, and these are permanent grasslands that were ploughed to plant bioenergy crops, and it just shows that what you do to your land can have a really big impact on soil carbon. And so the model here predicts a fast loss from the initial ploughing establishment, which doesn't really recover. Now, this is what the model shows. We've got evidence from lots of sites across the country where this hasn't happened, or where this loss is smaller and then it does recover more quickly. But it just shows that these crops can have really varied results. And the underlying thing is, if you start with soil that's got not very much carbon, you're going to improve the carbon. If you start with soil that's got high carbon, you've got more chance of doing damage by ploughing. Another couple of sets of projects are funded through this programme, which is funded by the Research Council, called Soil Security. And the whole point of the research programme was about trying to improve our understanding of soil and the sustainability of land management. We've got a couple of projects. One is looking at how management intensity of arable and grasslands impacts the soil microbes and how that feeds through into how the soil functions and soil health. And so we've looked at extensive through to intensive grassland management, trying to make links between these massive soil properties and microbial diversity, which is a huge complexity in the soil, but trying to simplify that out and understand how management affects that and how that affects how the soil performs in terms of plant productivity or carbon storage or water infiltration or all these more useful parameters. And just to say, from that study, we've also got similar LOI, loss on ignition, organic matter measures, which showed across our gradients that, low organic matter in arable, higher in intensive grass, much higher in species-rich grasslands. So similar patterns to the kind of things Jenny was showing earlier. We've also got another project which is more about developing tools and soil quality indicators, but with similar targets to assess how management intensity affects soil function. And the idea of all these projects is to try and inform policy so that we can say to policymakers, these are the kind of management activities which you should be subsidising, and to inform farmers, hopefully, in the longer term. Finally, just to flag up a proposal which is being developed with PFLA. I keep doing the PFLA thing as well. It's a microbial technique. At least it's got it wrong as well. Sorry. But essentially, so this is a proposal that's being developed at the moment, which is really trying to link these agroecological measures of soil and plants and management through to working with farming groups to see actually what are the practices that you're doing and how are these things linked in terms of holistic assessments, but also tools to measure outcomes. And so this is something, it's a proposal to a global food security call. So it's got through the first hoops and then now compelled the grant for the second hoop. I won't talk about that one, that was too complicated. But this one's the Soil Carbon Cowboys, which John just referred to, and I wasn't going to mention this until John sent the video around, but this is a group in the States, and it was a huge project, mainly funded by Shell, to look at soil carbon sequestration under adaptive paddock grazing, which is basically what they call mock grazing. And there are quite a large number of ranchers in Canada who were implementing really similar practices, or have been doing for quite a number of years. And Shell, it might seem quite counterintuitive that they'd be interested, but they're interested in carbon offsets and carbon credits. And so they're supporting research which is looking at, if you change how you manage land, can it sequester carbon? Because they're not just trying to offset by just buying a forest somewhere, but they really want to understand how management works. And so we've been working with one of the chief soil scientists at Shell for a number of years, and we were asked to go out and do this experiment on some of the farms. So the video that he sent the link to is some of our guys from Lancaster out in the fields with some ranchers with enormous handlebar moustaches. So it's quite entertaining. So, now to the real topic of today. Jenny's already touched somewhat on sort of carbon and organic matter and why it's important, but I just wanted to reinforce those messages which are for farmers. For you guys, like managing the land, organic matter and carbon can give you real benefits, and it's important because it can contribute all these different functions, which as scientists we call ecosystem services. They're things that the soil is doing for us that aren't just about plant productivity. but they're about nutrient cycling. It improves soil aggregation, soil structure, water infiltration, and also future resilience to climate change. And that is really important because if we're going to get more extreme weather, potentially more drought, heavier rainfall, our soils need to be able to cope with that. And so organic matter and increasing organic matter can contribute to all those things. For society, keeping carbon in the soils is really important for mitigating climate change, but it's also really important for you because if we mitigate climate change, then this resilience will be less needed because things will change less. Why is it so complicated? The carbon cycle is complicated, like the nitrogen cycle, for different reasons. And so I just wanted to just give you a little schematic here about why that complexity makes it sometimes difficult for us to measure, and particularly to measure change. Soil carbon exists in lots of different forms in the soil, different pools or fractions of kind of terms we use. And CO2 is captured by your plants. Those plants die or get trampled in your grazing systems into the soil. There's also the roots and the root exudates. And all of that is decayed and decomposed by the microbes in the soil and by the activity of soil fauna. That activity and decomposition processes means you end up with carbon in the soils which has different stability, different accessibility to microbes, so it's stuck to different degrees to the soil particles. It can be accessed by the microbes to different amounts, and that affects what comes off as CO2. Your management affects all of this because it affects the quality of the carbon going into the soil, so your plant composition, if you've got a more diverse plant community, that means that the plant material going into the soil will stick around different lengths of time because some plants decompose faster than others. Management, the amount of livestock, how the livestock are on the land affects bulk density and lots of other soil properties. And all of these things affect soil carbon, organic matter, and how we measure it and the measurements we make. So I'm going to just talk about these three measures of organic matter and soil carbon as kind of the more formal measures that we do. But it's important to know that what you measure depends what you want to know. And if you want to know about soil health and soil function in terms of your farm productivity, I would say that organic matter content is the thing that you want to know about, because as Jenny described, organic matter content is a real function of soil health, an indicator of soil health. If you want to express the carbon sequestered by your farm or your soil in terms of a carbon calculator or, I don't know, a marketing tool for your brand, being able to say my farm sequestered exactly this amount of carbon, then you need a more precise measurement. But if you're just interested in how do I make my soil healthy and function better, then LOI or something similar is going to be enough to give you that information. And the reason that you would choose one or the other is that as you go down this, it gets more difficult and more costly to measure. And so that's why it's important to be measuring something appropriate. So just little demonstrations from my little helper Kelly. So these are just really simple ways that we measure soil carbon, and I just thought it'd be worth talking them through. So to measure organic matter content and total carbon, it's the same sampling design. You just need a small core. You can take multiple cores across a field, and I think I don't work a lot on farming, but I know that the kind of standard for sampling farm soils is some kind of W sampling across a field where you get a distribution of samples and cores. You take those soil samples, you mix them up in a bucket, you take a subsample and you send it off for your analysis, and you can do that for loss on ignition for your farm. The depth is debatable. I mean, in science generally, we try and sample down to 30 centimetres to get depth, to get an estimate of soil carbon. But if you just want to know how things are changing in the short term, a 15 centimetre there is probably enough to be assessing. We also know that actually in grasslands down to a metre, there's a huge amount of soil carbon. There's a huge amount of soil carbon below 30 centimetres. But if you're interested in how your management is changing, it's going to be impacting the surface soils first. So, as has been already said, loss of ignition is the kind of method of choice for organic matter content. If you're just trying to compare in your farm or with a neighbouring farm or over time, it's a simple enough measure. Total organic carbon is again something that's fairly simple. It's just combustion of the soil. You can improve the accuracy by pre-treating the soil to remove inorganic carbon. But again, if you're just looking for change over time, that's probably not necessary. For organic carbon stocks, it's much more time-intensive, labour-intensive measure, and this is where, if you want to know how much your farm is sequestering, the total stock of the carbon in the soil. And to do that, you need a measure of full density as well. And there are various different ways in which you can do that. The simplest option, which we use in some of our projects, are just little plastic tubes that you hammer into the soil and dig out. And that gives you a volume of soil, and then you can measure the carbon concentration and calculate the stock. A more robust way is to use this thing, the split core sampler here, which just has less effect on the bulk density as it goes into the ground. So it's a more accurate measure, but it's a much bigger, sturdier piece of kit. So we've used this option for the countryside survey, where we were getting people to take samples from across the country. They hammer a bit of plastic into the ground, they dig it up, and they post it back to us. It's something that you can do on a big scale. This would require, the core is at the back, it weighs a ton. It's not something we can send through the post. So there's different things. And finally, this one over here is our meter deep corer, which is a pneumatic corer to get right down into the soil profile. And that gives us a much better measurement of carbon stocks across the board down to the depth of the soil. As far as measuring the timing of your measurements, if you're interested in carbon change, as Jenny and Richard have both said, it takes a long time to change soil carbon and organic matter. You could try analysing every year, but trying to detect change is really difficult over such a short time scale. So I'd say 3 to 5 years would be a minimum interval that would suggest you're measuring that. An alternative is if you've got fields on your farm that haven't gone under the new management, or you've got a neighbouring farm that's got the same soil type that's close by that you can compare with, then you may be able to do that kind of substitution, space for time substitution, which is something we've done with bioenergy crops, where we didn't have time to plant a bioenergy crop and look for 20 years what was happening. So we just looked at a neighbouring soil, a neighbouring farm. So that's something to think about. And the other thing I would say is soil archives are really valuable, and so keeping soil from these analyses is something that we do along just as part of our kind of day job, really, because having that record of soil change over time is important, and we can store soils and archive of these kind of measurements. So just quickly, John asked me to talk about soil apps, and these are things, as I said, you can get on your iPod and iPhone, which CEH and the British Geological Survey have developed. The most relevant to you are all held on this UK Soil Observatory, which is a website you can access. And the contact at CEH is a guy called Dave Robinson, who's actually supposed to be here today instead of me. And he's been very involved in developing these apps and also getting out to the community to promote them. There's a huge amount of information held on here, and you can look, there's a really detailed map viewer which can give you different layers of information about these soils. And so it's just, at the moment, it's not something interactive, it's just something to look at and explore in terms of information about soils in your area. But the idea is that it's being developed in a way in which we can actually use it for benchmarking and use it to collect information from land. And so the vision for this is that actually we will be able to feed into it data from the kind of measurements that you're hoping to do, to improve the resolution of measurements, and that there'll be this process of taking a sample that's GPSed in a field, having that analysis, feeding that data into the app and improving the resolution of the measurements. And so David's really interested in trying to link with this group to think about how we can take that forward in terms of using it as a benchmarking tool. Another one is My Land Cover, which is a similar idea but just for what's above the ground in terms of it's based on the land cover map for the UK, which CEH produces, and it's a really high resolution map of land cover all over the UK that you can again zoom into your particular location and see. And we're asking the community and the public to feed it back information where things are wrong on that map, and so we can improve information there. And on the UK Soil Observatory, there's there's loads of these apps. You can just go and have a play if you've got a spare half an hour. I think one of the most interesting to this group is something that's only available to Scotland at the moment, but they're currently trying to get funding to extend it for England as well. And it's called Socket, Soil Organic Carbon Information, which is an app developed by the James Hutton Institute. And again, it's an app where it won't give you very precise information on soil carbon content or stocks, but it will give you approximate values based on your GPS location, soil type, and you can get data. And so they're looking at that as a little info tool. I think that's about it. Yes, thank you very much.